In 1945, German officers began sitting down in Allied interrogation rooms. They were asked about tanks, about artillery, about air power, about why an army that had conquered most of Europe had finally broken. But when the questions turned to the Americans, the answers carried a strange contradiction. The Americans had not always impressed them. In Tunisia, German units had watched American formations lose contact, scatter their reserves, abandon equipment, and retreat through mountain passes in confusion. Less than 2 years later, those same Germans were describing an enemy that could absorb a disaster, diagnose it, replace the people responsible, and return with new methods before the next battle was over. That was the disturbing part. Not that the Americans never failed. They failed violently. The disturbing part was that failure did not stay failure for long. Between Kasserine Pass and Bastogne, two armies were changing in opposite directions. The American army was learning how to trust initiative. The German army was learning to fear it. And by the winter of 1944, the amateurs had become dangerous for one reason Berlin never understood in time. They kept getting better while the war was still happening. The first lesson arrived in Tunisia. On February 14, 1943, American tank crews near Sidi Bouzid watched dust rise beyond the eastern hills. Many of the men were new to combat. Some replacement soldiers had barely joined their units. Command posts were too far from the front. Positions were scattered across isolated hills that could not support one another. Then German armor appeared. The 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions did not attack the American line as a single wall. They moved around it, through it, and behind it. American tanks counterattacked in separate groups. Artillery support arrived late or not at all. Radio nets filled with fragments instead of a clear picture. By the end of the day, burning Shermans marked the desert. Over the next week, the collapse widened toward Kasserine Pass. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles. Heavy weapons were abandoned. Fuel and supply dumps were destroyed in panic. Units that had existed on paper no longer existed as coherent forces in the field. Thousands of Americans were killed, wounded, or captured. The battle did not expose a lack of courage. It exposed something worse. An army had sent brave men into a system that did not know how to use them. At the center of that system was Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commander of 2nd Corps. Fredendall directed the battle from a headquarters far behind the front, inside a tunnel complex cut into the rock. Engineers had spent time and explosives building that protected command post, while forward units struggled for mines, wire, communications, and clear orders. Fredendall rarely saw the ground his men were expected to hold. His instructions sometimes arrived in private nicknames and coded phrases that subordinates struggled to interpret. The Germans were moving real divisions through real mountain passes. American officers were trying to decode what their own commander meant. That was the humiliation beneath the humiliation. The failure was not only tactical, it was cultural. The army had promoted men for peacetime competence and then discovered that combat asked different questions. Could a commander see bad news clearly? Could he move toward danger instead of away from it? Could subordinates tell him the truth without being punished? Could the institution remove him when the answer was no? Dwight Eisenhower studied the reports. He did not decide that American soldiers were incapable of fighting Germans. He decided that the command system had failed them. Fredendall was relieved. In his place came George S. Patton. Patton entered Singapore with noise, flags, polished helmets, and rules that seemed almost theatrical. He ordered strict uniforms. He demanded salutes. He inspected shaving, posture, traffic control, and guard positions. He wanted officers visible near the front. He removed men he believed could not command under pressure. Some of it was vanity. Some of it was discipline used as theater. And some of it was a deliberate message to an army that had begun to doubt itself. The message was simple. You are no longer allowed to look defeated. Patton was not a saint, and history does not need to pretend he was. He could be cruel. He could be reckless. He would later disgrace himself by striking hospitalized soldiers suffering from combat exhaustion. But in Tunisia, he did one thing Fredendall had not done. He made command presence impossible to fake. Officers had to know their units. They had to visit the line. They had to answer for confusion. They had to move information upward and orders downward fast enough to matter. Uniform rules alone did not defeat the Germans. What mattered was the machinery behind them. American artillery officers rewired how requests for fire moved through a division. Forward observers did not have to control a single battery and hope it was available. They reported a target. Fire direction centers calculated the solution. Guns from different locations could be massed on the same point. A German infantry unit might hear one ranging round and no more were coming. Against well-coordinated American artillery, warning could disappear. Shells fired from different distances could be timed to arrive together. One moment, a road junction was quiet. 3 seconds later, it was under the weight of an entire division's guns. In March at El Guettar, the German 10th Panzer Division attacked again. This was not a different German army. It was not even a different German division. It was one of the formations that had helped shatter the Americans only weeks earlier. But the ground in front of it had changed. American positions were connected. Minefields had been laid. Artillery was registered. Commanders had a clearer picture of where reserves were and how to move them. German armor pushed into the valley and struck mines. The formation slowed. American anti-tank guns and artillery opened fire. The attack failed. The Americans had not become invincible. They had become organized. That difference mattered more than confidence. The German commander in North Africa, Erwin Rommel, understood the danger earlier than many men in Berlin. He had seen the Americans perform badly. He had also seen how quickly their resistance hardened after the first shock. That should have produced a warning. Instead, German leaders kept the picture they preferred. They saw a young army from a civilian society. They saw material wealth without military tradition. They saw men who had not spent years under arms. They mistook inexperience for a permanent condition. That mistake became more expensive every month, because the American army was not merely replacing tanks and filling ranks. It was building feedback loops. After action reports moved from battlefields to training centers, training bulletins changed, replacement programs changed, artillery procedures changed, commanders changed. The institution was imperfect, often wasteful, and sometimes brutally slow. But it possessed one strategic advantage that did not appear on a tank specification. It could admit that yesterday's answer had failed, and then it could issue a new answer at scale. By the summer of 1944, the test had moved to Normandy. The Allies had crossed the English Channel, but the American advance soon entered the bocage. From a map, the country looked like farmland. From the turret of a Sherman, it looked like a maze built to kill tanks. For centuries, farmers had piled earth and stone along field boundaries. Roots grew through the mounds. Trees and brush turned them into thick walls. Sunken lanes ran between them. A tank trying to climb a hedgerow exposed its thin underside. A tank using the obvious opening entered a pre-aimed killing zone. German defenders did not need to hold every acre. They needed machine guns, anti-tank weapons, and a clear field of fire covering the few places American vehicles could pass. One small field could cost hours. The next field could cost men. The field after that could cost a tank platoon. The invasion had succeeded, the breakout did not. American headquarters could request bombers, engineers could use explosives, planners could draw arrows across maps. None of those solutions changed the physical fact in front of the tank crews. The hedge was still there. Then a sergeant began cutting German steel apart. Curtis Cullen was a cavalry sergeant from New Jersey. He was not the head of a design bureau. He did not have a laboratory. He did not command a division. He had access to mechanics, scrap metal, and a problem that kept killing people. Soldiers in his unit had discussed the idea of putting teeth on a tank. Cullen took it seriously. The steel came from German beach obstacles. Heavy iron intended to stop Allied landing craft. It was cut into prongs and welded onto the front of an American tank. The device looked crude because it was crude. That was not a weakness. It was the reason it could be built quickly. The modified tank drove into a hedgerow. Instead of climbing and exposing its belly, the steel teeth bit into the base of the mound. The tank punched through. A German obstacle designed to stop the invasion had been turned into an American tool for continuing it. That alone was clever. What happened next was more important. The idea moved upward without being strangled. Officers saw it. Senior commanders watched demonstrations. Omar Bradley ordered production expanded. Ordnance crews worked across the First Army. Before Operation Cobra, roughly 3 out of every 5 First Army tanks carried some form of hedgerow cutting device. The invention was not perfect. It was not the only hedgerow solution. It did not win Normandy by itself, but it revealed the architecture of the American advantage. A sergeant could identify a battlefield problem. A local shop could build an answer. Senior leaders could recognize its value. A mass army could reproduce it before the opportunity disappeared. The speed from idea to scale was the weapon, not the steel. The German army had once built its reputation on a similar principle. German doctrine had long emphasized Auftragstaktik, mission-type command. A superior gave the objective. The subordinate decided how to achieve it as conditions changed. That approach demanded competence. It also demanded trust. In the early campaigns of the war, German junior leaders often acted faster than their opponents, because they understood the commander's intent and did not wait for perfect instructions. But by 1944, the political system above them had begun to poison that strength. Hitler's interference deepened. No retreat orders multiplied. Officers learned that reporting disaster could sound like defeatism. Tactical withdrawals required approval from men far from the ground. Commanders were judged not only by what was possible, but by whether their reports matched the Führer's expectations. The doctrine of initiative remained in manuals. The habit of initiative was being punished in practice. That is how strong institutions decay, not all at once. First, one honest report becomes dangerous. Then one necessary retreat becomes disloyal. Then one commander waits for permission because the personal risk of acting is greater than the military risk of delay. The German army still had experienced officers. It still had excellent weapons. It still had units capable of terrifying local counterattacks. But the space in which judgment could operate was shrinking. At the same moment, the supposedly amateur army was widening that space for a sergeant with a welding torch. On July 25, 1944, Adaptation collided with overwhelming force. Operation Cobra began west of Saint-Lô. About 1,500 American heavy bombers dropped more than 3,000 tons of bombs on a narrow section of the German front. Medium bombers and fighter bombers added still more. The target included Panzer Lehr, one of Germany's most respected armored formations. The bombardment overturned vehicles. It severed communications. It buried command posts. It left survivors stunned inside a landscape that no longer resembled the ground they had occupied that morning. General Fritz Bayerlein later described a formation that had been smashed almost beyond recognition. Then American infantry and armor moved into the rupture. But Cobra also exposed the price of American power. Bombs fell short. 111 American soldiers were killed. Nearly 500 were wounded. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces. McNair had helped shape the vast training and organizational machine that expanded the U.S. Army from a small pre-war establishment into a force of millions. Now he had been killed by an American bomb during an American operation. There was no clean triumph in that field. Only a breakthrough mixed with error, force, and grief. Yet McNair's death revealed something the German command system could no longer guarantee. The American machine did not stop when one of its architects died. Training continued. Replacements continued. Lessons continued moving. New officers took over. The system did not depend on one man being physically present to permit every decision. Germany's system was moving the other way. More power was concentrating at the top, and the man at the top increasingly refused to accept reality unless reality obeyed him. The contrast was becoming lethal. One side could lose a senior leader and continue adapting. The other could preserve its supreme leader and still lose the ability to think. Once Cobra broke the front, movement returned. American columns poured through the gap. Patton's Third Army entered the campaign. The war that had been measured in hedgerows became a race across France. This speed created its own chaos. Fuel ran short, roads jammed, units outran maps and communications. German resistance did not vanish, but the Americans were now operating with a growing expectation that local leaders would solve local problems. That expectation did not prevent mistakes. It changed what happened after a mistake appeared. A broken bridge became an engineer problem. A blocked road became a military police problem. A missing fuel convoy became a logistics problem. A German strongpoint became an artillery problem. The institution carried an enormous collection of specialists, radios, trucks, repair units, and staff procedures that could turn an obstacle into a request, and a request into organized action. This was not glamorous. It was dangerous in a way battlefield mythology often misses. A professional enemy can prepare for courage. It can prepare for a famous general. It can prepare for a specific tank. It is harder to prepare for an army in which thousands of ordinary people are expected to notice, report, improvise, and connect their solution to a larger machine. Then winter came. On December 16, 1944, German artillery opened fire through fog in the Ardennes. The sector had been considered quiet. Inexperienced American divisions held long stretches of front. Veteran units had been sent there to rest. The weather grounded much of the Allied air advantage. Behind the barrage, German armor and infantry moved west. The offensive was Hitler's last great gamble in the West. The aim was enormous: split the British and American armies, seize Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into a political crisis before Germany collapsed. In the opening days, the attack worked. American positions broke. Roads filled with retreating vehicles. 2 regiments of the 106th Infantry Division were surrounded and forced to surrender. The image from Tunisia seemed to return. Green Americans. Confused headquarters. German columns exploiting shock. For a brief moment the old judgment looked correct. Then the American system began reacting. Not perfectly, not calmly, but rapidly. Units were redirected. Road networks were controlled. Reserves moved toward threatened junctions. Commanders rebuilt a picture from incomplete reports. At the center of the southern fight stood Bastogne, a Belgian town connected to the surrounding region by 7 major roads. Control the junction, and German forces could keep moving west. Lose it, and traffic would be forced onto slower, more difficult routes. The 101st Airborne Division was ordered toward the town. Its men had expected rest. Many lacked proper winter clothing. Some replacement soldiers had not fought with the division before. Trucks carried them east through freezing darkness toward a place most had never heard of. They did not arrive as symbols. They arrived cold. They arrived short of equipment. They arrived because the road network mattered and someone had to hold it. The division commander, Maxwell Taylor, was in the United States. Command fell to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, an artillery officer serving as acting commander. That detail mattered. Bastogne would become famous for airborne infantry, but its defense depended on a web of infantry positions, tank destroyers, engineers, armored units, supply personnel, medics, and artillery. McAuliffe understood fire support, so did the men around him. The Germans surrounded Bastogne by December 20. Ammunition tightened. Medical supplies dwindled. The wounded crowded cellars and aid stations. Snow and fog kept aircraft away. German forces attacked from multiple directions, looking for a seam. American artillery shifted from threat to threat. Observers called targets. Fire direction centers masked batteries. Guns fired until barrels and crews were exhausted. The same institutional language that had begun to mature after Kasserine was now holding a frozen road junction against an enemy offensive. This was not the victory of one weapon. It was the result of many parts staying connected under pressure. On December 22, German officers approached under a white flag with a surrender demand. They described the American position as hopeless. McAuliffe read the message and reacted with a single word: nuts. At first, it was not intended as diplomatic language. It was frustration. Then Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard recognized that the accidental answer was better than a carefully polished one. The reply was typed and sent back: nuts. The word became famous because it sounded like the American defense felt. Blunt, improvised, defiant. But the paper did not hold Bastogne. Guns did. Foxholes did. Supply calculations did. Men in frozen boots did. Armored crews outside the town did. The slogan survived because the system behind it survived long enough to make it true. On December 23, the weather cleared enough for Allied aircraft to return. Supplies dropped into the perimeter. Ammunition reached the guns. The wounded gained a little hope. To the south, Patton's Third Army had already begun one of the most difficult command movements of the campaign. When the German offensive opened, Patton's formations were facing east. Within days, elements disengaged, turned north, and moved over winter roads toward Bastogne. That maneuver was not one man shouting an order and an army instantly turning. It required staff work, traffic control, fuel, maintenance, route planning, communications, and subordinate commanders capable of acting through confusion. At the front of the relief effort was Combat Command R of the 4th Armored Division. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded its 37th Tank Battalion. On December 26, Abrams faced the kind of decision that exposes a command culture. The formal situation encouraged caution. His force was depleted. Reinforcements were still moving. The German line was dangerous, but Abrams believed a gap existed. It might close if he waited, so he attacked. A Sherman named Cobra King drove at the head of the column. Late that afternoon, its crew reached American positions around Bastogne. The siege had been pierced. The moment is often told as a cavalry charge. It was more revealing than that. Abrams could act because the army around him expected a lieutenant colonel to exercise judgment. If he failed, the consequences would be real. But he did not need a telephone line to Washington before exploiting a battlefield opportunity. That freedom had limits. American commanders could still be rigid, vain, and disastrously wrong. The campaign in the Hurtgen Forest had already shown how badly American leadership could waste lives. Bastogne itself had been made necessary by an intelligence and deployment failure in the Ardennes. The American army did not win because it had eliminated incompetence. It won because incompetence was not protected as sacred. Bad leaders could be relieved. Bad procedures could be revised. Unexpected ideas could move. Junior officers could decide. Surgeons could build. The system was noisy, uneven, and sometimes cruel. But it remained open to correction. The German system was closing. After the war, captured German officers tried to explain the difference. Their accounts were not perfectly objective. Some blamed Hitler to protect their own reputations. Some exaggerated German professionalism. Some minimized crimes or presented defeat as the result of material inferiority alone. Their testimony must be read carefully, but across many accounts a pattern appears. They emphasized American artillery, American ammunition, American air power, American logistics, American speed in replacing losses. And they noticed something less measurable. American units could recover. A formation might perform badly in its first fight, then return with different leadership and different procedures. A junior leader could make a local decision without waiting for a distant headquarters to understand every detail. An American failure could generate an institutional response. That was the part German officers found difficult to predict. They could estimate how many tanks faced them. They could count artillery batteries. They could study roads and bridges. But how do you calculate the combat value of an enemy that treats humiliation as information? Kasserine had shown the Americans what they were. Bastogne showed what they had become. Not fearless, not flawless, not morally pure. They had panicked. They had surrendered. They had bombed their own men. They had sent units into forests without a strategy worth the cost. They had promoted commanders who should never have commanded in battle. The transformation did not erase those facts. It depended on facing them. That was the real divergence between the two armies. The German army began the war with a deeper professional tradition, more combat experience, and a doctrine that rewarded initiative. Then dictatorship reached downward into operational judgment. Truth became politically dangerous. Withdrawal became betrayal. Obedience to fantasy became a test of loyalty. The American army began with less experience and a smaller professional base. Then war forced it to build learning into survival. A tunnel-bound corps commander could be removed. An artillery procedure could be redesigned. A sergeant's welded scrap could reach an army commander. A replacement lieutenant could call for the fire of multiple battalions. A lieutenant colonel could see a gap and move before it closed. That is why the Americans became dangerous. Not because they stopped making mistakes, because mistakes could still change them. The Germans had once mastered the art of giving subordinates an objective and trusting them to find the way. By the end of the war, the Americans were practicing that principle with increasing confidence, while Hitler's command system was destroying it inside the army that had made it famous. Two armies crossed in opposite directions. One entered the war experienced and became less able to tell itself the truth. The other entered inexperienced and built a weapon out of honest failure. The decisive American advantage was not a general. It was not a tank. It was not even abundance by itself. It was a culture that could turn defeat into a lesson into a procedure, and a procedure into power before the next battle arrived. The Americans did not become dangerous when they learned how to win. They became dangerous when they learned how to lose without staying defeated.